Hello and welcome to this video on creating an informal upright. An informal upright is also called Miyogi or Moyogi, depending on how badly you butcher Japanese pronunciation. Unlike the formal upright, there is leniency in style and execution. Despite this, the informal upright is still visually appealing and beginner-friendly. In this video we'll look at an informal upright, much like the formal upright, beginning with the formal requirements of this style, what you need to do to achieve it, and what can be changed with the example of nursery stock. Finally, any points to be wary of when styling your informal upright. The formal and informal uprights are a staple of bonsai. Of the two, the informal upright is the more beginner-friendly. As you see here, the informal upright is made of a very limited number of elements, and they are clearly defined. The informal upright is defined by the way the trunk bends in an S shape and is visible from base to apex. At each turn in the trunk, a branch grows out. The first branch begins at the first bend, unlike the formal upright, which is dependent on the height of the trunk. Like the formal upright, the trunk tapers from root base to apex. The root flare should be pronounced. Like the formal upright, the tree has an appearance reminiscent of a person with open arms and a bowed head. In practice, this is harder to achieve than a formal upright when using nursery stock. The reason for this is simply because nursery stock is nearly always grown to be straight and wide. The informal upright needs movement in the trunk. This is why you begin with a tree that has good taper and size. Doing so allows the tree to be styled with one of two techniques. The first involves brute force. Taking a straight trunk, you can either use heavy gauge wire or a heavy duty branch bender. You use either tool to twist and move the trunk into the typical shape. Remember to twist the trunk and bend on the wire. Doing otherwise leads to snapping of things that should not be broken, particularly the trunk. This is often easier done when you remove unwanted branches, which in the case of an informal upright is a case of catch-22. You can only reliably identify and select branches when the trunk is shaped, but beginning with nursery stock, you need to remove branches to shape it. When forming the trunk shape, the first bend from the root base should bring the tree slightly forward and then backwards. Bringing it towards the viewer initially will draw the viewer into the tree and the elements of most interest, which in this case is the movement of the trunk. Assuming you chose to go ahead with this approach, and are willing to work at the problems, you now need to move on to the next stage. This involves wiring the branch structure. As noted earlier, the informal upright has branches growing from the turns in the trunk. This is not from the inside of the curve, but only ever from the outside. These turns are sometimes called the elbow. Branches growing from this point can take several forms. The two most common are a standard, slightly sloped branch, and the other is closer to a bar shape. Select branches that are larger towards the base and spaced roughly evenly apart. Later on, you can amend this as needed. The standard form uses wire to force the branches as needed to create a slight downward slope with the ends of the branch flicked up, almost as though they had been forced down by successive years of heavy winter snow and springtime growth. With some trees, you may wish to deviate from this, but that is an exception rather than the rule. The second is a little more difficult to explain and describe. This involves one branch that comes off from the trunk and bifurcates. The two parts of the branch go in two different directions, with the larger continuing away from the tree in the direction of the original branch. The other travels back towards the trunk and slightly beyond. When in full leaf, this creates a leafy canopy for a backdrop to the trunk. This is used with unbalanced trunks, branches, and defects, or to make up for missing and damaged branches. Finally, there are the back branches. These generally grow from the middle or elbow of each twist. This is important to remember, as the back branches give depth to the tree. With them, the tree has a 3D appearance. Without them, it has a two-dimensional appearance. This also means back branches do not need to be as long or as substantial as side branches. The exact size and length is at your discretion, but for the appearance of substance, they do not need to be substantial. The branches should contain some movement from left to right or vice versa. This is important for aesthetics and to give the branch ramification necessary for structure later on. Try to snake the branch as it grows and develop branches from the outside of the branch movement. Directly downwards or straight branches will conflict with the overall aesthetic and appearance of the informal upright. This is unlike a formal upright, which may look better with only a gentle slope to otherwise straight branches. Examples of both of these are ancient Californian redwoods, which have an almost straight but slightly sloped branch, and old pines, which tend to grow in a slightly snaking, deviating manner from the main trunk. Overall, the informal styling lends itself to the use of gin and shari due to the naturally worn and weathered impression this style gives. There is also a second means of styling an informal upright trunk, but it takes substantially longer and carries more risk. This involves bending the trunk base into position and positioning the first branch. You position the second branch so as to form the new trunk and cut off everything else. You repeat this process until the desired height and branch structure is achieved. This has several advantages with taper, distance between branches, length of each turn, and so on, but it is substantially slower, with maybe 2 new branches and a twist every year. It requires a number of other actions which can also be risky. Cutting into the tree on such a large basis, and on such a regular basis, runs the risk of infection, mold, and other damage to the tree. This can, however, be very effective for uncooperative specimens. The same ideas apply to styling the branches with this method as the other. As with other styles, once you have the trunk and branches styled, you move on to the apex. The apex of an informal upright is mostly a curving of the trunk to bring it forwards, towards the viewer or tree front. Ideally, it will be twisting in towards the trunk's center line from the opposite side to which began the tree's first turn. The apex of an informal upright disperses into many small branches, rather than terminating sharply. This creates a final foliage pad, incorporates redundancy, and overall softens the top of the tree. If this has been done correctly, or at least mostly correctly, you now have a tree that should be twisted and gnarled by comparison to the original stock. It will hopefully have a considered amount of negative space in how you designed it, and be about 1/3 shorter than when you began. You'll need to fertilize, water, and clean up your tree. In the process of explaining this style, you'll note it is very similar to the formal upright. Unlike the formal upright, you want considerably more open space between the leaf pads and branches. This is important with the style, and balances the overall appearance. Another concern with this is that you will find that nursery stock is often either not of acceptable quality or very hard to work with. This is why collecting specimens from the wild is a better approach, and if given the opportunity, you should take it for that reason. Wild specimens are often treated very badly, whether that is by park authorities or by simply the owners of the property. In either case, you will find that wild specimens are more prone to the necessary twists and jerking motions of the trunk needed for the informal upright. Next is wiring. You need to be wary of both the wire as it may cut in and how your wire is used to best bend the tree. In the first instance, fast-growing or sap-heavy trees are liable to be damaged quickly, and almost daily checks are needed. You'll note that, at least in the initial stages of training an informal upright, you'll need to wire it heavily and regularly. You'll also need good wiring discipline, and only bend on the wire. Tree trunks will often survive very harsh treatment if you twist the branch or the trunk and bend on the wire. Bending on branches and the trunk will tear and break the wood fibers, whereas twisting will do less damage. Bending on the wire puts pressure on the wire, which then transfers to the trunk, which reduces the amount of direct damage done to the tree. For this reason, styling an informal upright, whilst easier in many respects and more forgiving, also requires better attention to very specific areas, such as wiring. You may also be tempted to let branches run out too far for this reason. Remember, this is a tree that in appearance has survived harsh weather. It will either not have had the opportunity to dedicate precious growth to things that would break, die, or be damaged during winter, or winter itself has removed this excessive growth. The side branches should be moderate if not compact. The last thing to note is do not let the trunk be too standardized or regular. You will find some very stunning trees in the informal upright style, but these are not highly regular. They will deviate slightly by finishing a twist early or having a shari somewhere in lieu of a branch. In a similar vein, do not be afraid to consider your tree for winter or bare tree displays. Unlike the spring flowers, autumn colors, and summer foliage, bare tree or winter displays revel in the structure of the branches and trunk, which an informal upright is ideally suited to displaying. The informal upright is a beginner-friendly, flexible, and adaptable approach to styling many species. This makes it an appealing first specimen or project. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it useful, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.